Titus. So we learned a little bit more about Titus and all this kind of important stuff that Paul packs into this little greeting, describing who he is, what his work is, the aspect of God's activity in all this, all that stuff. We got to verse 4 finally, so we have it from Paul to Titus. And this is basically, everything in between is just fleshing all this out about all that God has done to bring all these things to pass, where Paul and Titus have this relationship. And then we have verse 5, which is where we're kind of picking it up today, where Paul is actually giving Titus his kind of directions. Here's what I want you to be thinking about, Titus. I left you in Crete as my pastor, my hand-picked guy, and I gave you work to do. And the work I gave you to do was twofold. And that's where we got into this stuff last week. And we mentioned that he has two purposes. And the first purpose was to set things in order. That's his first task. Get things in order, have an orderly arrangement in these congregations. And he says in every city. So every place in Crete, he wants there to have a new kind of church set up in each city. Crete's a good-sized island. If you've looked at your geography, it's not a little teeny island like some of these little teeny Greek islands. Crete's a good-sized island right smack in the middle of the Mediterranean, south of Greece. And so this is a pretty good-sized area, and Titus is responsible for all of it. There'll be a lot of different little cities or towns in these places, and Paul wants there to be things in order, and he wants in each place an elder. And that's where we kind of left off last week as Paul gets into talking about this task of getting an elder. So that's where we are, verse 5. So let's just kind of read and get up to speed here a little bit. For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains, get everything up in place, organize the churches, and then appoint elders in every city as I directed you. And so he wants there to be an elder in every city. And this word elder, we talked about this a little bit last week, just kind of introducing this. This basically means pastor. And we need to recognize this. The New Testament, on occasion, will use the verb, usually the verb shepherd, to shepherd the flock. And that's where we get the word pastor, because pastor comes from the Latin word for shepherd, a pastor. Pastoral scenes, pasture, all has that same kind of sound to it. So caring for flocks, caring for the herds, that's what pastors, shepherds do. But the word that gets used most often in the New Testament for a pastor is one of two. It's either elder, which means old guy, or it's an overseer, a bishop. And the Greek for bishop is episkopos, and the Greek for elder is presbyteros, and we get the word Presbyterian from presbyteros, and we get Episcopalian from episkopos. And so both of those church bodies, Presbyterians and Episcopalians, are named for one of the ways to name the pastor, elders or bishops. And so that's where this stuff all comes from. So the bigger point, though, is what's kind of interesting right off the bat is that Paul wants Titus to appoint elders. And I just mentioned this in passing last time. This is not meant to be an extended class on church polity or how things are organized, but it comes into play here. It becomes relevant because we have the idea that Titus is appointing pastors. And he doesn't suggest in here that Titus needs to get a vote or organize a call committee or have these congregations decide who they want to be their pastor. Titus is to appoint. And so Titus has this authority to say, you're the guy, you're going to go be the pastor here. And the guy would say, okay. And the congregation would say, all right, we've got our pastor. We're good. So it's a kind of a different attitude going on here already. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So appoint elders in every city as I directed you. So there's a way that Paul wants this done. Paul's already told Titus about it, and now he's reminding Titus about it. And this lends even more weight to the fact that this letter is addressed to Titus, but who's the real recipient? The whole congregation. Everybody there in Crete, all the Christians in Crete, he knows you're going to hear this. And so in a sense, Titus doesn't have to be reminded of what Paul told him. He knows. And even what we're going to have here is the description of all these things that God expects, or that Paul expects, is more for the congregation to hear than it is for Titus to be reminded. He's doing this to teach the congregation also. And so, what does Paul want? He wants elders in every city as he planned it, as he directed it. And how? And then verse 6 gets into this. So now we start getting our description. And this is where things get interesting. If any man is above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion, for the overseer, and so these two are synonyms here. Notice they're used in parallel. Elders in every city, the overseer must be above reproach. So we got that twice in here, up here and down here, as God's steward. And that's the third word we can have for name for a pastor. And I had a blank there for you for that. For a good measure, the third. The third one here is steward, which is a little different. We don't hear that word used a lot, but it's the word that gets used this time as a steward, as he says. A steward, God's steward. And then not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of sordid gain, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. And yes, from verse 7 until the end of 9, that's one long sentence. All right? And that's, again, the English is trying to follow how the Greek works with often these kind of just long, strung-out clauses and phrases that all get held together. Very rarely do you have neat little short sentences. That's just not how Greek tends to operate. Paul is a master of it. We have these long sentences. Now, several things to talk about here. Let's spend a little bit more time on this third term for pastor, steward, because this gets really interesting. Because the word in Greek, and I'm just finding my place here in my text, so the episkopon, the bishop, the overseer should be, okay, as God's, right here is theou oikonomon, okay? And I know you guys don't read Greek, but I put it up here because I want you to begin to get familiar with just, it's okay to see Greek and don't get freaked out. It's all right? So we have theou is of God, and this oikonomon, which in English looks like this. Oikonomon. Now, the word is really interesting. I started talking about this last week and ran out of time. The first word here comes from oikos. Oikos is the Greek word for house, all right? And nomos is the other word here. And nomos, some of you might have picked this up because I talk about this frequently. Nomos is the Greek word for law. And so an oikonomon is house law. You say, well, house law, what's that? Well, are there any ways that your household works? Do you have rules in your house? I'm willing to bet some of you do. Some of them are quite explicit. No shoes in the living room. No shoes on the carpet. Or whatever. You know, pick up your dirty clothes. Make your bed in the morning. Whatever. Don't leave dishes in the sink. Run the dishwasher. Clear the dishwasher. Whatever. You've got house rules. I'm willing to bet. Probably quite a few of them. That's the basic idea of this. Oikos nomos is house rule. And so an oikonomos, the steward, well, what's steward got to do with this? Well, see, there's a whole lot going on here. This idea, this house law, house oikos didn't just mean the house as in the building. It meant everybody underneath that roof. Everybody underneath maybe all the roofs. If it was a villa or a farm or an extended compound, which was quite common, all right? You would have a courtyard, buildings around it, and the family would live here. And then if it was a large family or a family involved in business, you would have servants here. They were all part of the household. Because in the ancient world, business and family were all bound up together like crazy. And so the idea of the oikonomia, the household law, was basically how things function in our home. And that meant not just family rules, but business rules, like raising the crops, or selling the oil, or importing the bread, or whatever you were doing. That task had to be organized. So was that a business? Absolutely. And so the guy who was in charge of that business, what was he called? The household leader, the oikonomos, the steward. So you see, this is where this all starts to tie together. And the reason I'm spending some time on this is I want you to see the interconnectedness of this. So the steward is one who is overseeing how things work in that household. Now, what's the implication then when Paul says that this presbyter, this old elder guy, this pastor, this bishop, an overseer who's watching things, is also God's steward? What's this saying about the church? How is Paul envisioning this church? What's he see it as? Same thing. Household. In other words, he's looking at this church, these people of God, as a household. What's the key word here that we haven't even used yet is the idea of family. And that's kind of what's going on here. Paul is envisioning that the church is functioning as a family. And so what's the job of the pastor in the family? He functions like the steward. Even better, he functions like the father. That's exactly right. Okay? This is an intentional kind of move that Paul's making here. He's building this whole idea up. And so this overseer, this elder, needs to be this God's steward. All right? So we have these three terms here for pastor. We have elder, and we have bishop, and now we have steward, because the church is like a family. In fact, we can be really interesting here, and I can be quite provocative, and I'll just throw out a few little thoughts here to get you chewing on this a little bit, but I don't want to spend a ton of time here. But in fact, when you read the New Testament and pay attention to the teaching of Jesus, what's the order of priority? You've got church, family. Which one is most important as far as Jesus is concerned? Churches. Absolutely. And so family is always secondary to church. And this is clear from Jesus. Family relationships always play second fiddle to church relationships. Now, do Christians think that way today? Not a lot of them. I don't encounter this a whole lot. What I usually see is family is the most important thing. And then what's the church's job? Support families, strengthen families, help families, serve families, because families matter. Right? And this is standard. We have family ministry. We have family-friendly churches. We're here to help your family. It's all about family, 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 family. And then the church is here to help the family. That's not the New Testament model. New Testament model is church. Church is the thing. And the family is part of the church, and you raise kids in your family to do what? To be part of the church and faithful in the church. The church takes precedence. That's a strange thought for most Christians, because we don't operate this way. And the very thought of, sacrificing family for the sake of Christ and his church, no. And you see this all the time. You see people who will choose family relationships over church because family is most important. Well, now you've got a problem, because families become your God, not Christ. You see the distinction here? And if this gets you a little bit troubled, excellent, because I want you to think about this. Because I want you to say, well, wait a minute, are you serious? Yeah, I'm dead serious, because Jesus is dead serious, and so is Paul. This is exactly the point he's making. And we aren't taught to think this way. And I'm convinced the church is complicit in this, because I think the church all the time elevates family to the sacred status of it's the most important thing. Then our people get confused when they start doing things for the sake of family and neglecting the church. We say, well, how'd that happen? Because you taught them that. And so we need to teach a little more clearly that the church is what matters here, guys. It's following Christ that matters. That's exactly what Paul is getting at. So the steward is the one who is overseeing this family, because the family of Christ, following Christ together, that's the thing that matters. That's what Paul's getting at. Okay? All right. So now let's get into the details of what's expected. Anybody want to push back on that? Give you the chance. Ask questions. Oh, go ahead.
I was just thinking while you were talking about this, about the Amish idea of ordinance, which is not ever written, but everybody knows.
Yep. Yeah. So the Ordnung, the structure, the way things are, and there's a way of being, and that's straight from German for direction, order, structure, exactly. This idea of ordering, it goes back into the Greek all over the place. It's much more prominent than we give it credit for. This idea of God has a way of things working. It's absolutely the way. That's quite right. That's very good. All right, good. So now let's get into the details of what Paul expects. So he says twice, he wants his pastor of the church to be above reproach. Twice he says this. So what's it mean? What do you hear? When you hear above reproach, what's that mean? Come on, people. You're not. No one would question. Good. Anybody else? What comes to mind? You hear above reproach. What's that all the way back? Squeaky clean. I like that. I like that. No one's going to question. Squeaky clean. Why? Why is that mentioned twice? It's important. So does this mean that the pastor has to be perfect? We'll be looking for a long time. Okay? So what do we mean by above reproach then? Squeaky clean, no one's going to question. What's the goal here? What are we trying to accomplish with this standard of above reproach? Does this mean no criminal record? Okay, good. You're above reproach. We're good now. That's a pretty low bar. Perfect is a pretty high bar. So what are we going for? Well, something in between. But why?
Doesn't allow people to pull him away from his word.
He doesn't want people to pull him away from his word. Okay, we're going to get into that.
The word.
Yeah, the word, the whole deception thing, we'll get into that later. That's got a ton coming on that. What do you think? Why does this matter? A good example for the people, that's a big part of it. What else? Credibility. In the eyes of whom? The world especially. See, this is what's driving Paul. You need to recognize this. Paul always has an eye on evangelism, witness. What are we saying to the world? Because why does the church exist in the first place? To witness God's story to the world so people come in. And if you've got a guy who's leading the church who's not above reproach, and people think, we know him, he's got a reputation, he's whatever, is that going to help the witness of the church? Not in the least, all right? We know how this goes. Guilty by association, bad dude, not a good situation. We know how this goes. You pick clubs and businesses and all kinds of things based on the people you encounter. You got a rude cashier, you like going back there? No, this is not a good place. So you want a congregation being led by somebody who has a good reputation, frankly, is what Paul's after here. Above reproach means he doesn't have all kinds of baggage that's going to get in the way and cause trouble. So then when people are starting inviting you, hey, come to my church. Well, wait, I know your pastor. He's so-and-so. I want nothing to do with him. Well, you're right, I don't blame you. You see, this is not what we're looking for. So to be above reproach simply means he doesn't have baggage that's going to get in the way of the church thriving and the church doing its work of witness. Is that making sense? So that's basically the criteria. So does that have specific content? Not really. It's kind of vague and subjective. So who decides what above reproach means? Titus does. Basically, Paul does. In other words, they're looking at a guy and saying, that guy's got a good reputation. He checks around. Well, you know this guy, Apollos. What do you think of him? Oh, yeah, he's crackerjack. Great guy, solid family, good, solid. Whatever. All right, yeah, he's kind of shady in his business practices, a little sneaky. Yeah, I wouldn't trust him any farther than I could throw him. All right. Does that matter? Yeah, it matters. This is what's going on here. So above reproach means that he doesn't have baggage. That's basically the biggest point. He doesn't have stuff that's going to get in the way of the gospel. And witness here matters a ton. What is it showing to the world? Yep. Paul had a lot of baggage. How does he reconcile that? This bothered Paul a lot. He brings it up frequently. He talks about how me, one untimely born, the worst of all sinners, the least of the apostles, and God called me. How about that? And so part of the goal here, and this even enters into how we think about these things yet to this day, is does this mean you can't have any bad stuff in your record? And that answer is no. A lot of it has to do what you do with it. So in other words, no felons need apply, none of this, whatever. No, it's an issue of what are you doing with this and how have you handled it? Because do we know people who have got junk in their past and yet now we look at how they're living and thinking, wow, now that's got guy who's got his act together. Look what he's overcome. Look what he's doing. So that's where above reproach doesn't necessarily mean like perfect. You've got a clean record. It means how are you living now? What are you doing? And what is the reputation you've gained by how you've operated? So even though you maybe have this horrible past, you've now regained a new reputation. That's even more to your credit. So above reproach, yeah. And I think the way we often use this nowadays, frankly, with above reproach is that there aren't going to be surprises that are going to come out at the wrong time. And so part of the above reproach thing is that a guy needs to be upfront and honest and say, here's what went down. You guys still want me or not? And so it's not like, oh, we call this guy, he's our pastor, and then we learn something later like, wow, why didn't you tell us? Well, yeah, I didn't think it mattered. You know, and the secrecy thing becomes an issue. So the above reproach has a lot to do with the kind of transparency, okay? That's another part of it. Yep.
So how did the other churches, I mean, in Macedonia, you think they knew about Paul and he was,
Oh, did the churches know about Paul? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm quite sure they did because it was like part of Paul's story. See, and it wasn't. See, this is the whole point. Because for Paul, and I'm confident it was part of his story because it shows up in the New Testament 3 or 4 times. He tells the story again and again and again. So I think it was a standard. It's what he did. He told the story. And for Paul, that becomes the living illustration of what? The gospel. The whole point, yeah, the redemption, the restoration, what the gospel means. This is the whole point. Look what the gospel does. Living proof. And see, that's why for Paul, he is above reproach because here's the whole point, okay? If it turned out that Paul says this stuff and then it turns around that he's still cheating people, you know, leading a dissolute life or a double life, now we got a problem. There's something, now we're not above reproach, okay? All right. Husband of one wife. That's the next one rule we've got up here, okay? Whoops, I lost my English. Where is it? There it is. All right, so we're getting through our list here. If any man is above reproach. Now, it's interesting. Paul does this twice. First, he starts thinking about this kind of in general. As I directed you, and this namely is actually added. It's not even in the Greek. He just goes from as I directed you. Then he's kind of, if any man, you know, above reproach, husband of one wife, having children who believe. And so he's kind of, these are the basic things. But then in verse 7, he kicks in, oh, now we get to the official list. And it's sort of like as he's writing the letter, he's thinking, so Titus, make sure you establish pastors. You know, the way I told you, these basic things. Well, okay, I'll go ahead and list them. And so in verse 7, he starts listing. And so what verse 6 is doing is sort of like the general, this stuff, all right, let's go through the list. And verse 7, I'll point out to you in a minute, has a different character about it because it seems much more regimented list-like. Whereas verse 6 is a little bit more kind of thoughtful. These are kind of the rules that you have. These are how you should be thinking about guys to look for. So what should you be looking for? Someone who's got a good reputation and also someone who's the husband of one wife. So what does that mean? Good luck figuring that one out. People have been sorting this one out for literally hundreds of years. Husband of one wife. There are so many possibilities this could mean. And maybe you're thinking, well, that's pretty obvious. And is it? So, husband of one wife at a time? What's it mean? So does this mean you can't have 3 or 4 wives? Because was polygamy practiced? Not widely, but a little bit. So maybe, but that doesn't really seem to be the bigger issue because polygamy wasn't a big issue, but it seems to be part of this. So that could be one reading. Make sure you only have one wife at a time. All right, good. Or does it mean one wife, done, period? So husband of one wife, and then if she dies, you're out of luck, dude. Don't get married again because that would be 2 wives. Can't do that. Because it doesn't say in there about one at a time. It just says one wife. And if you take it straightforward reading, and you guys would like to say, I want to be a literal reading of the Bible, great. So that means husband of one wife means you get one wife, done, that's it. No remarriage, period. And by the way, what if you're single? Whoops, that's a problem too. Because if you read this straight up literally, he has to be the husband of one wife. Well, you better be having, where's your wife? Well, I'm not married yet. Well, you can't be our pastor. You want to, seriously, you want to read, you know, people sometimes, literal reading the Bible. Great, literal reading. Let's read it literally. All right? Husband of one wife, you're single, you can't be a pastor. You're remarried because your wife died. Sorry, you can't be a pastor. Is that what that means? Who knows? See, people have, like I said, people have been wrestling with this forever. Husband of one wife, what's it exactly mean? The best interpretation, how we usually operate, it comes down to an interpretation. I think it's this. Singleness, Paul affirms other places, so it probably doesn't mean that. The polygamy, really not an issue, probably not that. Probably what's going on here is the sense of you don't dump your wife and go off and remarry, and it's probably a divorce thing is a big part of this, frankly, is what's really going on here. Because this is something Jesus taught about. Divorce and remarriage was an issue. That was a far bigger problem in those days, and it's interesting how that's still relevant to today. And so this sense of not having, multiple past wives around can become a problem. And part of that gets into the above reproachness aspect of it, and part of it also gets into being a good steward. Why are you going through wives like crazy? What kind of stewardship do you have? What kind of guy are you really? And see, this is part of the issue. There's another side issue we haven't even touched on, which is the whole spiritual aspect, whereas like in Ephesians 5, Paul says that marriage is a picture of Christ and his church, and so the one husband and the one wife in this eternal relationship, that's a picture of Christ and his church, so the pastor and his wife should be imaging that. That probably enters into it a little bit as well. So there's a lot going on there, but it's interesting to think through, what exactly does that mean? Good question. So he has to be above reproach, husband of one wife. And now here's the third criteria, and the kind of general, having children who believe. What's that mean? Obviously. What's it mean? The pastor has kids who are Christians, right? That's what it means. Having children who believe. Okay? That's what it means. And he even adds a little bit more about those kids. Those kids, children who believe, and what else? They're not accused of dissipation. And the accused of dissipation is applying to kids, the children. So what's dissipation? Fancy word we don't use anymore for wild party animals. Okay? That's what it means. Dissipation. Kind of uncontrolled partying, drunkenness, dissipation. So let it all go, man. Party. That's what we're talking about here. So they are not accused of dissipation. They're not known as party animals, nor rebellion. And rebellion basically means not being in order, not being in your place, not having your act together. So this is a surprise, isn't it? So you mean a pastor's kids can disqualify the pastor from office?
It's almost like, this is the purpose for God is first, second is the family. And if you've got this family situation where you have more than one wife, or you've been divorced or whatever, and you got your children out here causing all this trouble. I'm sorry, church congregation, I have to go take care of my family and the issues they're causing.
All right, I think you're on the right track for here. Now, perhaps Paul has in mind those infamous pastor's kids. Right? Or even worse, missionary kids. You ever heard stories about missionary kids? They come in off the mission field and they're just wild and crazy and uncontrolled. These are infamous stories. Check it out. Google it sometime. MKs, and see what kind of things you find out about there. This is just legendary. So I'm saying these infamous stories, and PKs, oh yeah, PKs are the worst. I'm a PK, so that's why I can say these things. So I didn't just raise preachers' kids, I was one, or I am one. And so, you hear these stories, pastors' kids, oh man. Now, does Paul mean this? That the kids reflect on the dad, and the dad can be dismissed from his task because of his family? Yes, he means it. Yes, he means this. And again, this is like, whoa. So does it matter how you raise your kids? To Paul, it matters a ton. And if it matters to Paul, it matters to the Holy Spirit. I guess it matters to God. I guess it's kind of important. Bingo. This is hard for us to hear, especially in our American context where it's every man for himself. We all are responsible for ourselves, and kids are kids, what are you going to do? Kids are kids. What are you going to do? You try your best. You know, you get what you get. Who knows? Is that a scriptural way of operating? Not in the least, guys. And if you're starting to feel just a little burden as parents, good. That's exactly the idea. Because parenting is like the toughest, most demanding task you'll ever take on, because God expects a lot of you. All right? And that's exactly what Paul's saying here. So the steward, the elder, the bishop, the pastor needs to be above reproach, husband of one wife. He's got his family together. And see, it all kind of ties together to the above reproach, the witness he gives, and his ability to lead a household here. If he can't, and Paul says this other places, this is not the one time in the Bible where this is said. This is said multiple times by Paul. If he doesn't run his own household, how can he run the household of the church? Okay? It's an obvious, from lesser to the greater, kind of a fortiori argument. Come on. That's what Paul's getting at here. So, is it fair to judge a man based on his children? And Paul says, yes, absolutely it is. So the question is, do we do this today? Yes and no. I mean, in popular judgment, we probably do it, but frankly, at the seminary, we don't investigate potential pastors' kids. And it's not even on I don't think it's even on our application. We do ask about how many wives they've had. Are you divorced? Do you have more than one wife now? I don't think we ask that. We kind of assume that's not happening. But we look into the wife part, but I don't know that we even look into the kids part. You know, Tyler's shaking his head. No questions about family. Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of weird because the Bible seems to think it matters. In our American context, we seem to think, well, you know, whatever. And that's weird to me, frankly. I've always been bothered by this because I think it's because, I'll just call it straight. I think it's because we feel like, wow, we've started judging other people. Are they going to judge me and my family? Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to be, it's too personal, you know. And we all know, and this is true, every individual has the ability to go off the rails. And so if you have a kid who goes off the rails, does that mean there's a problem? And this is where it gets tough, because maybe it's no fault of the parents at all, but some kids are just that way. And the best example of that isn't even though it's not a kid, but is Judas. Because you got Judas, who is being nurtured by Christ himself, and Judas manages to go off the rails. So what's with that? So is Judas who failed, or did Judas fail? And so there are some times when kids mess up, no doubt. So that's what makes this complicated. So what do we do with these? How do we handle this? What does it mean to be of reproach? This thing gets a little messy. My sense is that nowadays we are so reluctant to ever question how kids are being raised or how kids turn out that we just kind of leave it all to the side. We don't even touch any of it. And I think we've gone way too far just kind of ignoring all of it. In my opinion, we need to pay a little more attention to those kinds of things. I think it matters. It goes to the character of the man. It goes to his ability. It goes to what kind of message does he have. And I would even go so far as to say that, as was kind of hinted at, if a pastor has a kid who starts going off the rails, maybe the pastor needs to step out for a while and deal with that. Because that's really important, and then come back to what he needs to do. That would not be a bad idea at all. In fact, I've counseled that, and I've seen it happen a few times. A good move. So that's the kind of stuff I think we need to be thinking about. And again, this goes against the culture. See, in our culture, you don't judge no, you can't ask any of those questions. You apply for a job in the secular world, do they ask you about your family? They can't. It's illegal. You know, that's irrelevant. But in the church, we play by different rules. This is what I want you to see, is just the contrast between how the church works and how the world works on this stuff. Yeah.
Small sins and large sins, and our small sins is fade to God as large sins. And the answer was yes.
Sure.
That's what we came up with. So, if a man, or I guess a woman, but if a man applies to the seminary and he is divorced, is he automatically excluded now? Wouldn't he have been back then?
Yeah, that's a great question. Would he have been back then? We don't know for sure. People have tried to do research. We don't know definitively yet. Is he today? No. The rule we have now is 2 strikes and you're out. And it's very subjective. I'm not involved in it because I'm not on the admissions committee. But the admissions committee operates with a man. If a guy applies and he has a divorce in his past, they find out what's going on, talk to him a little bit about it. And if it's like, she left me because I wanted to come to seminary, or she left me because, you know, ran off with somebody else. All right, you know, so there are no ways recognized. You can have an innocent party. But if a person comes in with 2, that usually becomes a no-go, usually, okay? And I'm not saying that's across the board always the case, but that's what I've been told, is that's kind of a huge red flag. Any divorce is a red flag, but then we start talking through it and find out. And there are guys who are admitted who have a divorce in their past, yes. All right, yep.
So then what about the redemption story? I mean, then if
Yeah. Well, that's why we talk to them and find out what's going on and everything.
and they are going to
And I'm not saying we even have guys who come in who are, maybe they were the guilty party, and yet because, you know, there's part of the story, whatever. So it's not an automatic out.
yeah, that's all.
That's all, it's not. Yep, Nancy. This, what I'm teaching? What's the difference? Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, this is not Paul opinion. This is not churchly pious opinion. No, this is straight up from Holy Spirit kind of, this is how it should be. And the fact that it gets repeated several times in the New Testament, the fact the way Paul's packaging it, yeah, it's the way it needs to be. Yep. Well, a little bit. In the Old Testament, Steve, you're always the Old Testament guy. This Old Testament fascination. Seminary guys would love you. My STEM colleagues are all OT guys, whatever. There's a precedent, yes. What's interesting is the precedent in the Old Testament was even more demanding. You know, couldn't be a eunuch, couldn't have any physical deformity, couldn't have, you know, and so they were going more even for the outward look of what you were representing. And so that's not present anymore. So there's nothing in here about being, you know, an amputee or anything like that. But in the Old Testament, that would have disqualified you. So, yeah, the idea of standards and qualifications have always been around. All right.
So do you believe that's changing now with, you say, some employers now scrubbing social media?
You know, that's interesting. So you do have employers who will look at social media and stuff, and usually they're trying to discern the character of the person. And they might decide, wow, this guy has got kids who are posting all kinds of crazy stuff. If they're really being diligent, maybe that would enter in. My experience is in our world today, it's kind of, each person is his own person, and we don't usually think kids matter much at all as far as what someone else is doing. And you'll even have people make the defense that, oh, I didn't do that, that was my wife, you know, who did that. Sorry, I had nothing to do with it, it's just my wife. Oh, okay, it's fine.
So with all this talk of marriage and children, do the Catholics kind of skip over that part?
Well, that's interesting, because see, did the Catholics skip over the marriage and children part? If you're reading, like I said, as a literalist, that would create huge problems for celibacy and that whole thing. They would say, no, we're following Paul's advice in 1 Corinthians 7, where he says, I want all of you to be like me, not being married. And so that's where they're going to pick up on that. And that's where, yeah, you read Scripture to interpret Scripture. The idea that you have to be married to be a pastor quickly gets shot down by other parts of the Bible. But if you're reading only this verse, you could draw that conclusion. That's the point I was trying to make about be careful how you interpret. All right, good? So let's get into his list. So verse 7 is where he starts actually working through what he expects. And so he says, for the overseer must be. And now, I'll just show you the Greek here really quickly, because this is kind of interesting to see how this plays out. So it starts with verse 7. For it is necessary, the episkopon, to be. And has his to be. And now he gets into his list. It says he is as a steward of God. And now it's just two words again and again. Not, athede is not self-willed. Okay, I'm trying to remember. Atheo. So not self-willed, not wrathful. And it's just two words. Not, and then the thing. Not the thing, not the thing, not the thing. And so what I'm pointing out is is very formulaic. They've got it down to single words. It's not like he has to use a phrase. When we translate it into English, it's not nearly so clean, but in the Greek, it's got a very clean kind of bang, 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 bang sense to it. And that's what gives you the idea that this was the standard list that everybody knew. Paul's just working through it. So the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward, and now the list. Not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious. What's that fancy word mean? Yeah, a little dog with a snout is kind of a pug, and usually it's got a lousy temper, okay? So pugnacious means likes to fight, okay? A pugilist, what's a pugilist? It's a boxer, all right? So fighting comes from this word pug, okay? So pugnacious means likes to fight, not fond of sordid gain, and so that's our list of negations. So he gives us 5 don'ts, okay? So 5 don'ts. And we'll get our list together here then. So let's go ahead and put it down. 5 things he cannot be. He cannot be self-willed. Fancy word for stubborn. All right? He can't be self-willed. He can't be stubborn, obstinate, hard to deal with. That's the first thing he cannot be. Second thing he can't be is quick-tempered. So he loses it fast. Quick-tempered. Doesn't mean you don't have emotions, but you've got to have some control here. And you don't go flying off and you get quick-tempered and kind of lose your cool. So a pastor who, loses it with his secretary once in a while or other people when they irritate him, problem, all right? Quick-tempered. He can't be addicted to wine. So it's not saying you have to be a teetotaler. The problem is the addiction, the obsession. So it can't be addicted to wine. Can't be pugnacious. And maybe the better word here for pugnacious, who likes to fight, is even the sense of bully. Kind of really gets after this pretty well. He's just, a mean guy. Kind of just nasty. And we know people like this who are just kind of prone that way. Kind of tends that way. Can't be a bully. And he can't be fond of sordid gain. And so we have this long thing. Can't be fond of sordid gain. But in Greek, it's just a single word. And the better way to translate it in Greek would be not a shameful gainer. Because being fond of sordid gain in Greek is just one word, is shameful gain guy. So you get ahead in kind of sneaky, crooked ways. And it can't be like that. And so every one of these things, we know people like this. We encounter them. Stubborn, quick-tempered, prone to addiction to wine, kind of a bully, likes to fight, just kind of have an edge, and fond of sordid gain, playing the game, getting ahead, because he's always grubbing for what's going to advantage himself. All of those things get in the way of a good pastor. And do those things get in the way of a good Christian witness? Yeah. So the bigger thing to recognize is, are these things that are true only for pastors? And the answer should be, these are things that we should be all paying attention to and recognizing as character faults and as failings. And Paul raises them to the level of, if you've got a guy who's struggling with any of these areas, he really doesn't belong in the pastoral office. And it's kind of self-evident why, isn't it? Because you imagine trying to deal with a pastor who has any of these shortcomings. How's that going to go? How's that work? It's just not good. It's not good. And what's interesting also, these are all character traits. See, this has nothing to do with his ability to manage finances. There's nothing in here about his IQ. There's nothing in here about his education. MDiv is not mentioned. And some of you know what that means, but MDiv is the degree you get if you go to the seminary for the whole 9 yards. You get a Master of Divinity. It's a professional degree, but a master's degree, and in the LCMS, it's the gold standard. MDiv equals pastor. But there's nothing in here about your education. There's nothing about how much education you need to have. Nothing. Nothing even about how smart you are. Nothing. Nothing about how much money you have, or, are you economically savvy? Can you read a spreadsheet? I know a lot of guys who struggle with those things.
If you look at that list of 5 and think about
Well, amen to that. And that's my whole point in spending time on this. You say, good thing I'm not a pastor. Well, no. This is supposed to apply to every one of us as we seek to follow Christ. And as the steward, the example, all the more so. Because if he's going to be telling his people, stop being so stubborn. Don't be quick-tempered. You know, he's got to have his act together. Because if he's that way, people are going to emulate him. Because Paul says all over the place, the pastor should be the example. Follow my example. So he's looking for this, but you're exactly right. If we don't operate this way, the church doesn't operate this way, the world looks in and says, you're like all the rest of us. What's the big deal? What's so special about you? You're just idiots like everyone else is. So what? And so the church should be striving to be different. And does that mean the standard is higher for you? Answer is yes, absolutely. You're following Christ now. Of course it is. Well, I didn't know that when I signed up. You didn't sign up. You got sucked into it. You're stuck. That's the way it works.
I think we do ourselves an injustice when we look at that list as exclusive.
Go ahead.
If that's all it, we can hit all five, but maybe the rest of our life isn't.
All right. So these 5 are good markers. There are more things even than these 5. So you can say, well, my vice isn't listed there. Whew. No, it doesn't work that way. You're right. This is kind of a fit your vice into the picture wherever it goes. Yeah. I saw another hand go up and, yeah.
Because this translation says arrogant for the first.
Yeah. Arrogant, self-willed, stubborn. In other words, kind of full of yourself.
So haughty,
Yeah. Haughty, arrogant, condescending. And it's just the Greek kind of best way I really get it is kind of full of yourself. You know, not humble. Yeah. Proud is, there's a different word for that, but it's this sense of, you know, yeah, haughty, stubborn, self-willed. That's kind of another way to put it. All right, good. So these are things you should be thinking about. If I'm prone to these things, like, you know, maybe I'm a bit of that way sometimes with people. Is that an okay thing? You just say, oh, that's just my personality. Or are these things you can actually have some control over? And the implication is you can do something about this stuff. And every one of you should be recognizing this. We have this tendency as human beings to we get comfortable with ourselves. We know our strengths, we know our weaknesses. We know things that are easy for us, things that are really hard for us. And we become quite comfortable with that, and we just kind of excuse it. It's just the way I am. It's just the way I am. You know, deal with it. And that should never be the attitude of a Christian, because we recognize that sin in our lives is never a cool thing, and we strive against it, and we work against it. And it's not easy. It doesn't come naturally. That's the whole point. But you work at it. And so if, you know, any of these vices kind of rings home, instead of just saying, I guess I can't be a pastor, you think, no, what do I need to be doing? How do I work at this? And you do have to work at it. And maybe you have to work tons harder than somebody else for whom it comes kind of easy. But I'll guarantee you, everybody alive has got something they're dealing with. It's just the way it is in our fallen nature. Nobody's walking around who's got it all together. So even a pastor might be dealing with some of that stubbornness that comes in, and that self-will, and learning to recognize that. It's not easy, but that's what God's calling us to do here. All right, so those are our 5 don'ts. Now let's get into our 7 virtues that he actually gives us. Let's start in verse 8 then. So he says, but what he should be. And now he gives us 7. And that's not by accident, because 7 is the number of fulfillment and perfection, a good number. Lucky 7, it's funny how these numbers just kind of last forever. You know, these things, the idea is how things work. So 7 is a good number, always been seen that way. So, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-controlled, holding fast to the faithful word which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. And so verse 9 is number 7 all by itself. He takes the 7th one and kind of expands it into a really big, fat idea with 2 subsets, and we'll talk into that. But the first 6 are pretty straightforward. 6 virtues. And what's also interesting in the Greek, these are single words. One word, one word, one word, one word, one word, one word. And then so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 single words. Bang, 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 bang. So we have 5 things not to be, 6 things you should be, and then a 7th, which is really important for the pastor, which he's going to expand out. And that's what I'm saying make my argument that verses 7, 8, and 9, this is a package deal, which is just standard. This is what it goes down. This is how it works. This is how Paul's operating here. So let's get into that list and get that jotted down for us. And you got different translations for these words, because none of them are kind of like set in stone. They all kind of get discussed and moved around a little bit. So how will you want to translate them? First one, hospitable. Hospitable. This is a great word because the Greek is literally a stranger lover. That's the idea. A stranger lover. And this is so funny because in our culture, stranger danger. We teach little kids, look out for strangers. And we have this xenophobia. You've even heard this, Xeno means the other. And phobia, you're afraid of the other. But the Greek word here is a xeno lover, a stranger lover. That's what it means to be hospitable. So you meet someone who's a stranger and you show compassion and concern and love. That's hospitable. In the ancient world, hospitality was a absolute obligation. And if you had somebody who would show up at your door and say, I need help, and you refuse them, that was a grave sin. In fact, in the ancient world, that would be a sin paramount to adultery. And so if a man was accused of being inhospitable, it was like, what kind of human is this? And what kind of person is this? It's so funny how this has changed also in our culture. We're just so different than this. But hospitality, huge, huge important thing. Why would that be important? What's that? Caring for the least of those, the marginalized. Why else is hospitality such a big deal in the ancient world? There aren't holiday inns. And you don't have other resources. You're kind of dependent on the people and the kindness of people. And so if you're traveling, you're hoping somebody will take you in. And if somebody gives you the cold shoulder or turns you away, what's your recourse? And so hospitality is important simply because this is what you need to do to care for people. It was just a given. You don't have any other alternatives. There's not social structures in place for this. There's not government institutions that take care of it. You're dependent upon other people. And in the household of the church, this was really important. That's why in the ancient world, if you would travel, you would get like letters of introduction. Oh, I have a family member here. I got a 4th cousin in that city. You can talk to them. They'll take care of you. And you would often show up with a letter saying, oh, I've got a letter from your uncle. Oh, okay. All right. Come on in. This is how this worked. And in the church, this became part of it. You're all familiar with the idea of the fish symbol for Christianity, right? You see it on cars sometimes. Well, it's an ancient symbol for the church. It actually predates the cross as a symbol for Christians, the fish. And so in the ancient world, they would put fishes sometimes on their doorpost to mark this is a Christian home. And so if a Christian comes to a city looking for help, there's a fish, great, they're going to take care of me. And so, and that's how they would operate. This idea of Jesus is Lord, yep, come on in. You're a brother. You're a sister. You belong here. So hospitality, big deal. All right, second one we have on his list is they should love what is good. And notice we have to write 4 English words for the single Greek word. A good lover is literally what the Greek is. Good lover. So he just loves good stuff. And this is not just, he's a nice guy. No, it's just a person who he loves good things. Loves when good prospers. Loves when good conquers. He kind of delights in this. So a little bit of a pushback maybe against the kind of who cares, cranky attitude about life, kind of a Scrooge attitude. Some people think, well, I'm just kind of crabby. Is that okay? No, it's really not. The idea of this kind of this openness to life and loving what is good is a thing to cultivate and not to cultivate crabby attitudes, frankly. All right? Third is sensible. And the Greek here is sophrone. And it's a great word because it's the word that Aristotle would use, which we translate as prudence. Exact same word here. So to be prudent, sensible, sophrone literally means right thinking. You've got a sharp head. You have a healthy head, healthy mind. So you're a good on the ball. You're able to see things. You're not dim-witted. So the IQ thing comes in here maybe a little bit, but we're not talking here even just about absolute intelligent quotient, but you're tuned in, on the ball. All right, let's put up one more here, and then we'll wrap things up for the day because we're getting tight on time. He needs to be just. And this is so interesting because this is also one of the 4 virtues that Aristotle would have listed: prudence and justice. And so Paul picks up 2 of them. He should be sensible and he should be just. And just means to treat people the way they should be treated. You're giving respect as appropriate. You're caring for people. You're giving what is expected. So you have good social skills, good ability to handle things the right way. That's key. All right, so we got 4 on our list. We'll get our last 3 and spend some time on that last one especially. Let's close with a word of prayer. Oh, wait, you got a minute. Any final questions today? Before I shut you down, yeah. Was Paul influenced by Aristotle? Paul probably would have been aware of him because Aristotle was 300 BC, so we're 3 centuries later. So Aristotle was known, and he was famous because he was the teacher of Alexander the Great. And so Aristotle would have been known. Paul would have been certainly familiar with Aristotle. And it's my opinion that I think Paul often would these were words that were just in the air. People would talk about them, they were standard, but Paul, I think, would sometimes use them and co-opt them and show that, hey, Christians fulfill these even in a greater way, and that's kind of what's going on. All right, good. Let's pray. Oh, God, we praise you that you have given us your church. Give us joy in being part of that church. And as we participate in that household, that family, give us also diligence as we address things in our own lives so that whether pastor or not, or whether we want to be a pastor, we recognize we are your followers and we live your way. Help us to address those things in our lives that need our attention and to be diligent in striving to become more and more the people you call us to be. We pray it in Christ. Amen. Blessings on the day, guys. We'll see you back next week.